Now here is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Yes, hello there. I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Coming up, Peak Business Lobby Group BCA Chief Jennifer Westacott joins me ahead of next week's budget to talk the economy and life post a Royal Commission. And the headline news is that Donald Trump gets off lightly from the long-awaited Robert Mueller investigation, but has he really? Not according to our White House watcher, Professor Ed Blakely. Lease picks up stage 2 of the big Garden Island Naval Defence remake. Assistant Minister for Defence turned the first sod. He came right in to explain a bit more on the project. But first, the New South Wales election. Well, Gladys Berejiklian rules again against all odds. You would have thought just a fortnight ago. It was for the leader of the opposition, Labor's Michael Daly, to lose. But that he did. Blunders over comments around immigrants, a line-up with the Shooters Party as the horrors of Christchurch unfolded, even his impromptu commitment out at Narrabri that Santos Gas would never ever get out of the ground under a Labor government, which put him at odds with really the most mild-mannered of the unions, the AWU. You may remember we spoke with Secretary Dan Walton after that one, and he was hopping mad. Well, Michael Daly, in his concession speech, was determined to bat on Saturday night, but today the party has decided otherwise with a leadership ballot on the way. But to say this was all about the Labor leader's failures is to sell out our Premier short, I think. Gladys Berejiklian's campaign simply got stronger as she neared the finishing line, and she appeared to as well individually, with a bit of campaign help from her funky sister Mary, of course, who told one social media troll carping at Gladys's appearance, famously now, to grow some pubes. She won the head-to-head debate, and her victory speech was pitch perfect.
I want to thank the people of this great state for having confidence in me and my government.
Well, she said she'd work her guts out, and I'm sure she will. What's the betting a female success story like Gladys Berejiklian will be pulled in to help with the federal campaign in key seats? But the biggest takeout for me from the weekend was actually about the reform agenda, the economic reform agenda. Former Premier Bob Carr, when I spoke to him last week, was hugely dismissive of the coalition's record of infrastructure spend from the privatisation of state assets. And he could be, because nothing major in road and rail has actually yet been completed. Here he is.
There hasn't been a new project, transport project, tollway, for example, or rail or light rail, that has opened in 8 years.
Well, now that she's won, Gladys Berejiklian is going to be cutting ribbons on a lot of projects in the next couple of years, including that pesky one out to the eastern suburbs that Bob Carr also mentioned. And it really will, I think, become the asset recycling state, and a fitting legacy for the bad Berejiklian era. In a rare example, the Liberals have been in for long enough to see a whole reform agenda come to fruition. Now, a state election behind us and the federal one ahead of us. And before that, just over a week, the Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg released the 2019 budget. We've heard today about some big health commitments, hundreds of millions being behind better hospital infrastructure, mental health services, research and a new cancer treatment centre in Victoria. Financial regulators will both be allocated additional funding, $400 million for ASIC, $150 for APRA. Also hearing the government is likely to bring forward the July 2022 income tax cuts on top of those already starting July 1 this year as part of an already legislated $144 billion plan. Well, joining me now is CEO of the Business Council of Australia, Jennifer Westacott. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you.
We've got the budget coming up, but I must just ask you about today, because everybody's talking about the bond markets, and both here and in the US, and gloom and doom, and the recession's on the way.
Well, I think we saw some economic figures a couple of weeks ago that really sounded a warning bell, and we should take it as a wake-up call. It showed two quarters of low growth. It showed that our big stumbling blocks are still stumbling blocks, our low rate of investment, our low wages growth. And I think this is where, government has just got to get back on reform agenda around making it easy to invest in Australia, making it easy to do business.
Do you agree with what I said about the New South Wales reform agenda?
Absolutely, and I'll come back to the New South Wales stuff if you will, but I think if people have got to kind of get some stuff done around growing the economy, around getting in business investment, around making us more competitive. You can't keep kind of walking away from this, because it does eventually show up in the economic figures, and we saw that in these recent results. So I think it's about doubling down now on making ourselves more competitive, doubling down on the growth stuff, doubling down on infrastructure, doubling down on tax relief, and if we don't do that, you can't. Eventually, you can't keep these things down the road.
So in that context, how does what we know about the upcoming budget sit with that? Because people are calling it like a bit of a stimulus. What do you think about these tax cuts?
Well, I think there's a couple of points to make about the budget. The first thing, it's really important to get back into surplus. I mean, a lot of people say it doesn't matter. It matters enormously, because in an economic slowdown, if your budget's in trouble, you've just got nothing. You've got no room to move. You can't do anything.
Well, the winds have been behind the government.
Exactly. But the headwinds are coming, and the last economic data showed that. The second thing about the budget is, let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to grow the economy. So, that should be the lens that everyone judges the budget. Apart from the things that governments must do in terms of essential services, and obviously doing the right thing in terms of health and education, infrastructure is crucial. Personal income tax we've been calling for, because they have a growth effect.
So you believe that the personal income tax cuts, that there will be additional cuts to the ones already announced, and looks like they're going to be very fast-tracking, exactly.
They've announced,
and focused on the lower income end. This is the right thing to do?
Well, that whole low middle income end, I think, is where people are feeling the wage pressure, people are feeling the cost of living pressure, and the wages, kind of getting wages up, is a more complex long-term thing, but the objective is get more money in people's pockets in the short term. So,
why is that a better way? I mean, the government is arguing that it's a better way than...
It's not a better way in the long term. But you've got to give tax relief to people. We've been calling on that for years. We would love to see something like an investment allowance, if you're not going to do the company tax stuff, to try and drive some stronger investment. We want to see...
And at an individual level, you'd be for the New Start allowance, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. I've been calling on this for years, that you've got to take...
What are the chances of that happening?
Look, people say stuff.
Why do governments of both sides have such a problem with doing something about, what is it, $40? It's rubbish. Why do they
it's
have
a very
such
small
problem
number
with
of people too. So we're not talking about, hundreds of thousands of people who are in this category. It just seems to me like a basic sort of decency to ask people to live on this amount. It's not going to help them get a job.
So I come back to whether you have tax cuts, which is what the government is suggesting, or, I mean, Labour is doing that as well, but they're saying a living wage is a better way to go about this than tax cuts.
But have they defined what a living wage is, or the policy by which you would do it? No. So a couple of things on wages. You can't get wages up if unemployment goes up. So top priority, grow the economy, keep employment strong. And the employment data out last week is very good. Second thing is, make sure that the EBA process, the enterprise agreement process, stays in place. Now, by all means, tidy it up, but don't wreck that, because it has given Australians higher wages. The wage price index 2.3%, EBA is 3.2. Make that work. But you've got to do the hard yards of lifting productivity. I mean, the data is just... People may not like, in the fake news world, the kind of reality of data. When productivity improves, people's wages go up. That's how you sustain wage increases. On the minimum wage, there may be something in the fact that the Productivity Commission said maybe the Fair Work Commission needs a better set of instructions to look at the capacity of the economy to absorb wage rises at the bottom end, and the circumstances of low-paid workers. But they do kind of put a warning that if you increase them, there are consequences if you dramatically increase them.
Well, I think Labor, was there a suggestion that Labor would like some of those increased productivity commitments of the Fair Work Commission to be removed, potentially? Yeah,
and I think you've got to be careful that you don't do something here that has a kind of short-term effect, but a long-term effect of seeing jobs reduced. I mean, and you've got to remember, this is a real small business issue. It's certainly not for the companies I represent, because they're mostly on enterprise agreements. But if you're a small business community, not a fat cat, a small business owner,
which is where most of the employment
happens, and you have to pay your people more, and your company doesn't become more successful. You've got three choices. You sack some people, you pay yourself less. Now, for a lot of small business people, their wages are their profits and they're not very high. Yeah. Or you put your prices up to your customers and that makes it really hard for you to get ahead. So, you know, people say stuff, Ticky, and you think, yeah, that sounds great, but you've got to have a plan to do stuff. And that's what I think the New South Wales election shows, that when you've got a plan to do stuff and stuff gets done, people respond to that. And I think it's not good enough to say wages is a problem. I've been on your show hundreds of times saying wages is a problem. It is a problem, but the way to get them up is the hard work of skilling people, of increasing productivity, of making sure that productivity falls to people in higher wages. And making sure the EBA process works properly, and looking at low-paid workers. So
since we spoke last, this whole idea of the power of industry super, the influence and pressure of pressure groups, including unions, but when you look at wealth inequality, of perhaps using super to pressure the boards of the big end of town companies to actually look at raising wages. Now, how do you see this whole thing?
I think this is a complete overreach by industry super. I mean, people forget a couple of things. Superannuation is compulsory. So when I put into my super fund, what I'm putting in is for investments that are going to pay for my retirement, and that's the expectation of all Australians. Of course, people are entitled to ethical investment. That is perfectly legitimate. But when you start crossing a line into political activism, which may in fact change the value of a company, you've got to ask yourself, is that really the job of
But some people argue, that I've spoken to in industry super and elsewhere, that actually, even though these sort of ideas of environment, indeed diversity, might look at long-term cost to the shareholder, short-term cost to the shareholder, long-term, if these companies want to be around in the long term, they've got to buy into it. Now, given wealth inequality is the great moral issue of our time, along with many others, yes. But isn't this actually going to be in that category?
Well, there's a fine line here, isn't there? Yeah. There's a line between we want to see, and I think most companies have got the memo on this. You know, you've got to be responsible, you've got to do the right thing by your customers, you've got to be transparent about your use of data, you've got to be transparent about you've got to rethink executive pay, you've got to rethink your relationship with your customers, you've got to rethink your products. And I don't know a company that's not talking about that. The challenge is if you start doing political activism using the funds of people who've put their money in for their retirement, I think most people are entitled to see the fine print on that, because I'm not sure that's what most people have bought into super for. By all means, do ethical investment, but when people start saying, we're going to force a company to do this industrial agreement, is that really what the superannuation schemes are actually for? We've got an industrial relations system. You know, by all means, people should sort of make that work more effectively. Yes. But once you start getting the industry super funds to do the job of the industrial relations system, the whole question of accountability, I think, just falls away.
Briefly, how do you hope that the budget will come out, particularly in terms of some of the concerns that they'll throw a lot of infrastructure at infrastructure? Maybe there won't be the cost-benefit analysis behind it.
Well, that's crucial that we get the right projects at the right time. And I mean, I do think there's a case for, maybe it's a conversation for another day, looking at the way some of these cost-benefit analyses are done, because you wouldn't do a lot of things in regional Australia and they're crying out for things. But, it's interesting. The lesson, I think, the lesson for the federal budget is the lesson of the New South Wales government, that if you get your budget in order, if you get your public service in order, if you get your debt down, if you get, your big infrastructure spending, albeit it's very disruptive, but, gosh, it's better to start something than not start something at all. And, I spent the day yesterday out at the Western Sydney Airport. People would just be staggered by the investment out there. If you get your house in order, you can spend extra money on health and education. You can do those big projects that people are crying out for, that are going to transform the way people live. That, to me, is the frame of the federal budget. Get our house in order, make sure we're investing in the things that are going to grow the economy, make sure we're putting, all of the things we can do to make ourselves more competitive, but let's not take our foot off the pedal of getting that budget under control.
Jennifer Westacott, thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
After the break, the Daily Telegraph state political editor Anna Caldwell on the latest fallout from the New South Wales state election.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Let's come back to the New South Wales election result. Now, things are moving very quickly. We understand Premier Gladys Berejiklian is confident that she can form a majority government despite regional voters turning against her coalition partner, the Nationals. Meanwhile, where the ground is moving is the future of the Labor leader Michael Daly. Now, it looks like, according to reports, that he has just announced that he'll be stepping aside until after the federal election, and that Penny Sharp will serve as interim leader in the meantime. But let's get the latest with Anna Caldwell, the Daily Telegraph state political editor. Anna, what can you tell us? Is that right?
Yeah, good afternoon, Ticky. This news is really just breaking as we speak. So Mr. Daly has decided have you got me? He will step aside. Yes, he will step aside until, as you say, after the federal election. And Penny Sharp, his deputy, now she's in the upper house and she's from the left, so it is quite an unusual scenario. She will step in as an interim leader while the election is carried out, until they do face this proper leadership ballot. Now, there has been talk about this all day. Labor MPs, Labor head office has been very worried about Mr. Daly being a distraction during the federal campaign. You know, they lost the state campaign on the weekend. They can see how things can slip away very quickly, and they don't want to be taking any risks.
Yeah, look, that is really interesting. I went through some of the sort of the bloopers. Obviously, they don't want him anywhere near the federal campaign. What's the significance of somebody like Penny Sharp from the left holding the fort?
Well, the significance is that they really had very few options when it came to considering an interim leader. They needed someone who wouldn't be standing for the ballot after the federal election. So that ruled out the obvious contenders. So people like Chris Minns, Jodie Mackay, they couldn't step in this interim position. Penny Sharp in the upper house isn't really considered an option to lead the party. So she is kind of seen as this steady pair of hands. She's you know, Penny is really good on policy. She's well liked by her colleagues. I think she's seen as someone who will be low key through this campaign. What they needed was someone who wouldn't create any drama, someone who wouldn't see Labor colleagues briefing against the leader, and someone who could show up to functions alongside Bill Shorten when he comes to New South Wales. And if Michael Daly was doing that, I think there would have been drama.
Yes, I'm sure there would have been drama. Tell me about one bright spot, which is the seat of Coogee, which I understand Michelle O'Neill has actually beaten Bruce Notley-Smith there. So the Premier would have to walk back from the fact that they didn't lose a seat. What's this seat victory mean? I mean, she's a young woman, isn't she?
Yeah, you're right. It is absolutely a bright spot for them. But I have to say, Ticky, it's not as bright as what they would have hoped. I mean, Coogee was a seat when we went into this campaign. Government sources were saying to me before, look, we expect Coogee will be gone by 6:20 on the Saturday night. They were expecting to lose it. You know, it's a seat with a changing demographic. There's been a number of issues there. Light rail has played a role. They expected to see it gone. So the fact actually that it was a tight vote really surprised some people in the end. But you're right, Labor has gotten home. They've done that in spite of even Malcolm Turnbull campaigning for Bruce Notley-Smith in Coogee. That's a good result for them. But I think, to be honest, I think they would have expected it to be even clearer.
Very briefly, what next for the Premier?
What next for the Premier? Well, the Premier at the moment is dealing with a flurry of calls over her reshuffle. Of course, you know, they've got to divvy up these spoils. So there are a lot of people who want to have a lot of spots in the new cabinet. So she's going to be working on that this week. And then from there, you know, as we said, she's got a mandate. So we're going to see a much more confident, bold Premier. She says that herself. And so she'll get on with her agenda. I think we'll see more focus on infrastructure, which is what she's known for, and onwards for the future.
Well, that's really interesting. Anna Caldwell, thank you very much for joining us there and your insights. Thanks.
Thanks.
Sydney's Garden Island Naval Base today gets a $286 million facelift to address significant condition, capacity and compliance issues. The Department of Defence awards Stage 2 of the Infrastructure Recovery Programme to Lend-Lease, with the programme expected to create 2,500 jobs. Well, construction is scheduled to commence in May, with completion expected in late 2023. Now, for more on this project and everything else happening on the defence front, I spoke with the Assistant Defence Minister, Federal, David Fawcett, not too long ago. Senator David Fawcett, nice to talk. Now, you've just turned the sod on the second stage of Garden Island. How important is it to the nation's defence?
Well, Garden Island is our premier Navy base on the east coast, and the importance of these upgrades, they're called the Critical Infrastructure Remediation Program because literally they are critical. Where we turned the sod was just near the main fuel tank, and the fuel tank that is there is close to 100 years old, as is much of the infrastructure, and so there are many parts, both from a condition and a capacity and compliance perspective on the base that need upgrading, which is why we've funded this $286 million program.
Bit of a coup for Lend-Lease, but I think they were part of Stage 1 as well, so they'd have had to have done something very wrong, presumably, not to get Stage 2.
Well, indeed. In fact, Phase 1 was a joint venture between Lend-Lease and Pacific Services Group Holdings, and that's an Indigenous company. And one of the targets we've got for Phase 2 is also to see about a 3% Indigenous engagement. And based off the work through Phase 1, we're seeing lots of engagement from people in the Indigenous business community.
And presumably this represents quite a chunk of the Indigenous procurement process as well.
Look, this is part, but I wouldn't say it's a big chunk. There's a lot of work happening right around Australia where we are engaging with Indigenous business.
Yeah, and more broadly, presumably, it's a great time to be in defence. You're spending a lot at the moment, spending a lot up north, I notice at the moment.
Indeed. So look, there's three large things. There's $200 billion that we're investing over the decade. That's for our own defence capability. And that's across both capital equipment, so things like ships and aircraft, but it's also including the infrastructure, so base infrastructure, information communications technology, and the 2016 white paper is the first time that we've actually incorporated not just funding and identification of the main equipment, but also all of that enabling infrastructure in what we're calling an integrated investment program. So that's a really significant change. But we're also seeing expenditure not just for our own purposes, but with the US Force Posture Initiative, there's investment that our industry is picking up on behalf of the US government in Darwin. And the Singaporean government is investing some $2.25 billion in central and North Queensland to develop the Shoulder Bay and the Greenvale training areas, which will continue to be owned by Australia and used with us having priority of use, but it means that they can now send out an increase of about 14,000 of their troops for training.
David, I'm wondering, given recent developments in the Pacific perhaps, and also, ongoing tensions with China, whether it be fair to say that some of the spending up north, some of the decisions more recently have been made in the sort of context of bolstering up, given the changes in the Pacific and with China?
Oh, look, we, for many years, Ticky, have had a defence presence in the north. I think it's fair to say that around Australia there has been an underinvestment, particularly in the infrastructure. And certainly, putting my political hat on, the previous government stripped some $18 billion out of the defence budget, and a lot of that went to infrastructure that hasn't been updated. So you're seeing a real investment in that, but also things like the Pacific patrol boats. We are building 21 of those as part of a program with our Pacific neighbours, and in fact the first of those was commissioned to service with Papua New Guinea in February of this year. So between that, things like the Blackrock Peacekeeping Centre in Fiji, working with Vanuatu and helping the Papua New Guineans to rebuild the Lombrom Naval Base, there's quite an investment into our region because we want to see it to be a prosperous and safe but stable region.
But in part, one would think that that's been in response to a recent Chinese interest in the region, a bit of rebalancing.
Well, it's been a balance from a range of factors, but certainly we recognise and we welcome China's involvement. We seek to engage with them both from a military training perspective, but also to partner with them in aid. But what we're keen to see is that nations in our region have the ability to develop their economies and their infrastructure without getting into situations where they are entrapped by debt or some forms of aid that have obligations on them.
And David, the other two huge contracts that we've looked at in recent months, the French submarines, the Barracudas, and also BAE's Type 2 frigates. Now, they seem to be rather different projects in the sort of support that they seem to be getting. I mean, are we definitely going ahead with the French submarines?
Well, definitely on both. I think one of the differences that you're seeing is that BAE already has a well-established presence in South Australia. The design of ship, the Hunter class, is already mature, and so what we're looking at is incorporating some Australian unique parts to that. For example, the CFAR radar, which is by any measure the world's most effective radar. So that's a, if you like, much quicker to stand up. What we're seeing with the attack class submarine is that contracts have now been signed and the design work is ramping up, but there's still a period to go before that design work is finished. And so whilst Naval Group is right at the moment looking to reach out to companies to build the submarine yard in Osborne, there is a number of years before people will start seeing the same level of work that we're already seeing for the Type 26. So there's already $535 million being spent right now in Osborne, and as you drive past there are cranes on the site, buildings are going up, and at the same time in the ASC buildings where the Air Warfare Destroyer was built, and that was one of the Howard government programs, the first of the offshore patrol vessels is being built as we speak in Osborne. So it's a hive of activity.
And presumably all these sort of contracts, big contracts now, require a demonstration of how they're going to help the domestic supply chain, small business and jobs.
Well, it's more than just an opportunity, Ticky. The whole reason we've taken this path is that we saw with things like the Collins that where you have a small fleet of a unique configuration, you absolutely have to have an Australian supply chain and a high degree of control over the design support network to keep those, in this case submarines, serviceable and effective in terms of their combat configuration throughout their life of type. That's true value for money. And so having put that supply chain in place after the Coles review, we're now getting regularly 4 and occasionally 5 boats out of 6, which is well above international benchmarks for submarines. And so it's not just creating an opportunity for industry. We're actually doing this because we believe it's really important for Australia's sovereign capability to have a navy which is backed up by a defence industry that, since the first principles review, we now refer to them as a fundamental input to our defence capability.
And just coming back to Garden Island at the moment, obviously one of the great successes in Sydney Harbour has been the rise of cruise liners. Now, as I understand it, they'd been looking at trying to get berths at Garden Island. I think they get rights to a couple a year. But I think more than that, Defence has been resisting. Are they going to get an opportunity to have more than a couple of berths?
Well, look, we've certainly resisted moving from Garden Island, even what they call the graving dock, which is the largest dry dock, I think, in the Southern Hemisphere, perhaps except South Africa. We need that for our vessels. Having said that, it's also used for some civilian vessels. But in terms of the cruise industry, they have an option to ask for up to 3 berthing slots during the peak season, subject to defence requirements. And to date, over a number of years, they've never actually sought to use those. So,
I mean, would it be a security issue, a big security issue?
For defence?
Yeah, to have huge liners with huge numbers of people on them.
Look, would it be our first preference? No, but the offer is there. But as I say, the offer has not been taken up. Were it to be taken up and defence security requirements could be met, then certainly we would work with the industry. But to date, it hasn't been taken up, and we continue to invest in that Garden Island precinct because it is vital to Australia's ability to raise and maintain and then deploy naval force into our region, whether for security or humanitarian purposes.
Finally, David Fawcett, just thinking about Gallipoli, Anzac Day is upon us again. Now, given the timing of Christchurch, of course, and indeed those comments by the Turkish President Erdogan, what would your advice be to Australians who might have been thinking of going to Gallipoli?
Well, it's going to be an individual decision for them. We obviously welcome the fact that President Erdogan has moderated his remarks and has given an assurance for safety, but I would advise people to look carefully at DFAT advisories in terms of making their decisions to go over. It's a significant part of Australia's heritage. We have built a constructive relationship with Turkey in recent years, and I'm very hopeful that that can continue.
Finally, we've had, 4 or 5 different defence ministers since 2013. We're going to have another appointment yet again come May. What are the chances of it being a Liberal one?
Well, I think they're very good chances. I think the economy is growing strongly. The only reason we can afford to invest all that we're doing in defence is because we have a government that is running a strong economy and enables us to invest both in defence but also health and education and welfare and infrastructure and all the things that make us a successful nation.
And do you feel buoyed by the New South Wales results?
Well, the people of New South Wales looked at the performance of the Berejiklian government and made their decision, and I trust the Australian people will do the same thing in May whenever the Prime Minister chooses to call the election.
Assistant Minister David Fawcett, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Ticky.
Yeah, everybody on that side feeling pretty good. After the break, what to make of the much-awaited Mueller report? Former White House advisor Ed Blakely next.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Welcome back. The long-awaited Mueller report into suspected collusion between Donald Trump and Russia during his 2016 election campaign has found that the president did not commit a crime, but it also does not exonerate the US leader, despite what he says, with special counsel Robert Mueller saying he would leave it to the Attorney General to decide whether a crime was committed. President Trump has labelled the investigation an illegal takedown, which failed.
It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. It began. And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown.
An illegal takedown. Well, for more on the Mueller report and what it means for President Trump's political future, I spoke with former White House advisor Ed Blakely a little earlier. Professor Ed Blakely, well, you told us that the Mueller report would come down within 2 weeks, and 2 weeks it was.
To the day.
To the day. To the day. Now, that said, bit of a thud. It didn't actually deliver what a lot of people were hoping for, presumably.
What they were hoping for, we haven't seen the contents yet. But I anticipate there'll be 3 things we see. One, the campaign was too disorganized to collaborate with anyone. And there was no one home.
Yes.
So the Russians are fairly clever people. They could do it without them. The second thing it'll show is that there was knowledge on the part of the campaign and several people about the sources of information they were getting. They had a responsibility to report that information. The president was not involved himself, but he was well aware of it.
So you think it'll reveal that?
Yeah, I think it'll reveal that. I think he was moving in that direction. The third thing is that the campaign was actually seeking out opportunities to work with foreign nations. That includes the Trump Tower, the things that Jared Kushner was doing, and the like. Those things will come before the House Judiciary Committee, and they'll make a lot more of them than Mueller did. Politically,
what do you think Mueller has set out to do? Do you think he was setting out to knock off the president, or those who wanted to use Mueller were setting out to knock off the king hit the president?
No, this is the 3rd time the United States has done this. Okay, first Nixon, then Clinton, and now. In the last 2, they ended up in very similar conclusions, that the president was perhaps guilty of something, but is that something enough to remove him. In the first one, the president resigned rather than face that. So what I think about this is, you know how in developing countries the courts are used to persecute the enemy for political purposes. This was actually a good thing for democracy, having the courts be used to find truth. Now, justice has not yet been all served, but there's the Southern District of New York, a federal court. There's still Virginia courts, Washington, D.C. courts, and most of all, the city and state of New York.
So what will go through those courts, do you think, now?
Well, the first thing that will go through those courts are Trump's financial dealings. And those financial dealings are considerable. They're so considerable that they're really troubling the president.
So this is an attempt not to knock off him as president, but to his businesses and his family's businesses.
And that's one of the things we talked about earlier.
Yes,
I said,
I remember.
What Mueller is trying to do is to, like an army general, knock out everything that supports the enemy, and then the enemy will have to surrender. Well, he didn't get to the surrendering part, but knocking out all those components, the family, the money, the assets, and the privileges of the presidency will now be severely tested. Trump was actually, in spite of a little bit of rhetoric, very calm about this because he knows those other steps are to come. And if he pushes too hard, the Democrats will push back very hard and the courts will push back very hard.
So how will this all now, though, play into the campaign? Because, you know, again, at a very public level, he has seen to have survived this great Mueller report that so many people said, well, wait for Mueller, you know, it's going to be dreadful news for the president. He's now heading into a campaign in 2020 where he came through Mueller.
He came through Mueller. Now he still has to get through Wisconsin, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. That didn't turn on him on this measure. They turned on him on the fact that he hasn't delivered on his promises for jobs. The economy's improved, but not for all the people.
Not for all the people, but for a lot of people. I mean, jobs have been, you know, the jobs numbers are amazing.
The jobs numbers are amazing, but the wage levels are very low.
Yes.
So
better than here.
The expansion is better, but not the base isn't better. Now, I think we have to look at what the Democrats can and should do. And we've been saying for a long time, they need a program and not a target. And the program has to be health care, has to be quality jobs, it has to be an immigration policy, and it has to do reform in the infrastructure of the United States.
And how do we see this funneling down of the likely candidate?
Well, Joe Biden is not biding his time anymore. Joe Biden's out there.
Yes.
So the question is, who's going to be the second in command, and what will the platform look like? Beto's out there. So that's right. Harris. These are the strongest candidates right now. Now, clearly some others can come up, but I think the agenda is going to be more important than the candidates because Joe has to be the candidate at this time. Trump is crippled, but he's not dead.
Ed Blakely, it's great to get your views. As always, thank you so much. Very important time.
Thank you.
Well, US markets received the clearest sign yet of a looming recession, they think, when the spread between yields on 3-month Treasury bills and 10-year notes fell below zero for the first time since 2007. And the drop sparked by preliminary measures of US manufacturing and services activity for March, showing both sectors grew at a slower pace than in February. Manufacturing grew at the slowest pace since June 2017, and both the Manufacturing and Services Purchasing Manager Index readings were weaker than analysts had forecast. So, should we be worried, or is the market getting ahead of itself? Well, for her analysis, I spoke with Nicki Hutley from Deloitte Access Economics a little earlier. Nicki Hutley, nice to have you in here. Now, we've got in the Australian market, the Australian 10-year bond yields at record lows. What do you read into it?
I think some in the market are frothing themselves up into some sort of hysteria that just is not justified by the data that we've got.
So talk of a recession or?
Yes, well, that's what it normally would imply. It's saying that, you know, growth is going to get so low that inflation is absolutely going to fall away from its current lows. And that is not where the momentum in the economy is going. Yes, we had a soft half in the last half of last year. But everyone's acting as though the current downturn in housing prices and obviously in construction activity for resi sector is like the end of the world, and ignoring the better parts of the economy, ignoring even the Reserve Bank that's saying, yes, there are risks to the downside, but there are also risks to the upside. And at the moment, it's too uncertain to say which way we're going. But, there's some people calling for the Reserve Bank to cut rates ahead of the federal budget even, before they've seen what stimulus is coming there. So I really think this is a case of mass hysteria.
And do you think the same thing could be said of the US market, where we've had this inverted yield curve coming over the weekend? So we've got 3 months yields above, now 10 years. Yeah,
I really don't understand, how it can be so overplayed, particularly in the US, that is much stronger and has been much stronger than Australia with all of the fiscal stimulus it's had with the taxes. Yes, some of that's coming out, but it's done its job and it's built up the momentum in that economy. We're seeing really good consumer confidence. Wages have been good. Employment, unemployment below 4%. There's momentum there. So this idea that all of a sudden the economy is going to, because the Federal Reserve has said, all right, it's time to just hold off for a little while. Yes. That doesn't signify that the economy is, going to recession. It just signifies that it's enough for the moment. We've got the right level of breaks, and interest rates are still so low there. They're still stimulatory. So.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the stimulus back here with the budget coming, as you say. Everybody is expecting these tax cuts and other forms of cash splashing. You've got a very important speech, I think, at the Press Club this week. What are you going to be saying?
Well, I won't give away all of my secrets, but I will be talking particularly about our infrastructure spend and the way we analyse the projects that get put up. We know, for example, that there's going to be a big regional package put forward. Yes. Look, there is no doubt that even Infrastructure Australia on their list is saying that some of those regional roads, they're important freight routes, they might need to be upgraded. But where is all the detailed analysis that allows people to really have a look at, OK, what's the justification for these projects?
So your classic cost-benefit analysis.
Absolutely. Everyone's expected to sit in that lockup and analyse everything in the space of a few hours and come out with, and we know that obviously the analysis keeps unfurling as the weeks go on, but it's always those headlines, and it's very politically motivated that, it's a lot of showmanship rather than necessarily economic stewardship. And
well, what would you like to see?
Well, maybe it's time to see it not play out as everything all on one night, but something slightly different style, a softer style, a little bit more analysis and in-depth and spaced out through the year. And maybe I'm just being, an economist nerd, but...
Well, no, but it's taken over. It's sort of dream on territory, isn't it? With the politics of the day.
Well, that's it. And we see, we've now got this off-balance sheet items, very large items as well, that could, be repaid basically on the never,
like
NBN.
The NBN and, being the obvious one.
The most obvious. I suspect there's a few others in there, Snowy Hydro and Inland Rail, that might eventually fall into that category if they haven't already. But the point is that we don't know enough, and irrespective of whether some analysis has been done, it's not been shared widely. Yep. And it's not publicised. And I think we have to have confidence, because we don't have lots of money to spread around. We've got to make really good decisions about what we spend our money on.
Having said that, thanks to commodity prices, the Treasurer is sitting on rather a lot of money at the moment.
Yes, but that's not going to last. That's the thing. And every time we get to the start of the budget and they're coming out the macro forecasts, and they're pretty well stuck with commodity prices. There's a definitive, we're not going to change from whatever it is on the day. So they've been saved to a certain extent by the fact that China, in being slower, has actually got fiscal stimulus that ironically has actually boosted commodity prices rather than weakened them. So that's given them a bit of a fillip, but that's going to fade. And I think when we get to the end of the year and the mid-year economic review, we'll all be going, oh, OK.
So you think that the budget forecasts are likely to be too optimistic in some areas?
Look, that's the way it has been consistently for quite a number of years now. And I think if you look back, the Treasury actually publishes, the budget time forecast for where it is. And if you look back sort of 20 years or 30 years, it was up and down as you'd expect. But more recently, it's all overestimation, over-optimism, particularly last year on wages and a bit on the employment side, things that we were never going to get. No one can get their forecasts perfectly right, but they have to be at least feasible. You shouldn't be seeing that, the first sort of shots across the bow in the Twitter sphere at 7 p.m. as the Treasurer speaks, going, oh my God, here we go again.
But you're particularly scared at these big lumps of spending that might be going out on big infrastructure projects, which will end up off balance sheet with no accountability. And I guess the trouble with, say, something like the NBN is that both sides have got paws on it, paw prints on them, don't they? I mean, both Labour and the coalition have contributed to the NBN.
Yes, I mean, Labor obviously was the one that set it off, but you know, Liberals had the chance.
Are we going to get
do
a write down,
things,
do you think, in the next government?
Oh, we will. Well, it may not be the next government, but it will. It depends what happens at the polls in May, doesn't it? As to who takes the write down, but eventually somebody's going to have to. And, you know, ultimately, whoever politically is responsible, it's you and I and everyone out there who's paying for it. So,
And finally, you spoke about the property market at the beginning. How do you think some of these policies might play into, what do you feel about negative gearing, for example?
We're in the middle of doing some work on that, so I'll reserve my judgment until I see the whites of the eyes on that. But I mean, I would just say that, you know, we have seen in the last year and a half, when APRA introduced macroprudential regulations that pulled investors out of the market, we have seen that affect Sydney and Melbourne. The question is, has that already happened, the investor effect, if you like? And I think, you know, the existing research out there, things like Grattan suggests this is more about revenue measures rather than about house prices per se. So, but as I said, I'll watch this space.
Yeah, we'll have you back. Nicki Hutley, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ticky.
And after the break, Brexit's impact on the UK market from an interested investor. Steve Johnson from Forager Funds.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back, and once again it's all happening over in Britain. Senior British MPs are rallying around Prime Minister Theresa May amid mounting calls for her to fall on her sword. Mrs May has summoned cabinet ministers to her country home for an urgent meeting where she's expected to seek support ahead of another crucial Brexit vote in Parliament this week. What will this mean for UK markets tomorrow and indeed the rest of the week with the critical vote on Tuesday? Someone exposed to the huge write-downs in the UK is our friend Steve Johnson, CIO at Forager Investment Funds. Now, Steve, it's very interesting. I just read kind of where we were. I understand at that meeting not everything was resolved. They've got a cabinet meeting today. It's all looking a bit wobbly, isn't it? Where do you sit?
It's all looking extremely wobbly, Ticky, and frustratingly so. I think everyone now is frustrated on both sides of the argument. You've got every person I talk to who's just living in the UK, can please just be over. They just want the whole thing to be over.
Well, there have been these amazing marches. There was a truckie demonstration and there was that 1 million anti-Brexit march.
And I think there's a belief, and I actually think there's some truth to it, but that people are just putting their own interests ahead of what needs to be done here. And it's quite... I mean, what is a change of leadership going to achieve with a week to go? It's not going to change the fact that there's infighting going on within... But those who want to leave and those who don't, and nobody actually has a plan. But
just to the actual sort of logistics of what might or might not happen, I mean, if she may not be able to get her third meaningful vote up, in which case then she has a shorter delay, does she?
I think the chances here of a disaster come the 12th of April, so it's now been extended to the 12th of April by the EU. I think the chances of that are slim because there is a significant majority of Parliament that doesn't want that to happen. And I think even the hardline Brexiters, the people who definitely want to leave, are getting to the point where they're recognising that maybe what's on the table is their best option. And if it doesn't happen, there will either be a much softer Brexit or potentially even no Brexit at all. And I'm surprised that
what
the momentum
victory for her it would be if she got her third meaningful vote across the line this week. Can you believe it?
To be honest, I feel extremely sorry for her because I don't think any individual in that situation is going to change the dynamics of the people that are scheming for power, thinking about Prime Minister 6 months down the track.
I wish I could extend my sympathy in the same way. What about your investments? What about your investments?
You said exposed to pain. I mean, we've already suffered a lot of the pain. It's been a horrible year to be invested in the UK.
You're still looking for opportunities there, having been a bit flooded?
Two buckets though. One of those buckets is stocks that are listed in the UK, but where most of the business is outside the UK. And I think for the same like-for-like apples for apples, you're looking at a substantially lower price for something that's listed in the UK than something that's listed
with all the
else.
kudos of it, even though it might have assets outside of the UK.
And just the index impact, like everyone that's saying, I just don't want money in the UK, so I pull money out of the index fund. It's selling everything that's there. So, you know, the largest position in our portfolio, it's less than 10% of the company's revenue and profits are in the UK. It just happens to be listed in the UK. And I think that business is trading at half of what it would be trading at in the US if it was there. So there's that bucket of stocks. I think there are businesses that are just being unfairly treated full stop. So they are domestically exposed companies, but they're pretty resilient. I think they're going to survive whatever happens here, but a recession is not going to be good for them. It's just a
Well, I was going to say, what is a downside scenario for you guys? And you're going over next week, are you?
I'm in the UK Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week. Look, I think the downside scenario is you have a pretty bad recession here. I think we're going to have an economic slowdown no matter what happens, because we've been doing a lot of work on an IT equipment company over there. They've actually had quite a good time of it because there's all these companies that are spending money preparing for Brexit, GDPR.
Well, Michel Barnier over the other side of the channel seems to say, well, let's go, you know. He was saying last week, we've got to get ready for this.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of money being spent at the moment in preparation, and I think you're going to get a slump either way, just from people, either a relief slump or a panic slump as well. So I think we're thinking about a downside scenario to deal with that. Anyway, the question is, you know, you're paying 4, 5, 6 times earnings for some of these businesses. Is that price low enough to compensate for the risk of those potential things happening? And we think there are select examples of that being the case, but we clearly want this to work out in a coherent, sensible, constructive way rather than a destructive way.
So you're going over with the hope of keeping what you've got there, but also looking for opportunities as well.
Hoping the borders open to start with and I can get into the country, but Look, I think it's going to be interesting just to get the feel for how things are placed over there as well. And I think that option of actually no Brexit here long term has grown fairly meaningfully, and I think that would be very positive for business and even confidence in the country.
All right, well, come back and tell us all about it when you get home.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Steve Johnson. And that's all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, fresh off a plane from the US, Bruce Wolpe, Senior Fellow at the United States Study Centre. Thanks for your company.